Welcome, everybody, to the Latino Vote podcast. Mike Madrid here, flying Chuckless this time. I think Chuck is out somewhere off of the coast of Baja, marlin hunting, marlin fishing, doing what he does, trying to decompress, gearing up for what is likely to be an exciting, I guess that's the word I'm trying to use here, year coming up, leading, I think, the Democratic Party towards hopefully what will be a resurgence of its fortunes, and I think he will be a central part of what the Democratic Party comes up with in the coming days, weeks, and months. And with that, I have somebody who has joined me today who is clearly going to be part of that direction and that narrative, specifically as it comes down to the Latino vote. Carlos Odio has been with us before on the Latino Vote podcast, and he has emerged. I'd like to say rapidly, but he's been grinding in the grill mist for many, many decades as sort of the premier Latino data expert in the country. And I asked him to come on to kind of help us walk through some of what we have learned to this point. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but we're going to spend the next part of this podcast talking a little bit about what we learned from Tuesday, separating sort of the wheat from the chaff, the fact from fiction, and provide some contours because there's so much floating around on social media as to what happened, what didn't happen. And there's nobody, I think, who's got a better finger on the pulse of data as it relates to the Latino voter than Carlos, a principal at EquisLabs. Again, one of the prime data firms. They do democratic work, but I think is respected across the aisle and certainly with the media and academic researchers because the work is so good. And it is, I would argue, it's so unique because of the specialty and the focus that they've established over the course of the past few years. Carlos, welcome to the show. Thank you for giving us some of your time during this hectic part of the cycle.
Thanks, Mike. And I appreciate the kind introduction. I will say, there's a broader ecosystem that's all working toward getting to better understanding, and I'm glad Equis can play a role in that. That said, my great takeaway here is we can now say anything we absolutely want about Chuck. Like, this is our chance to get it all out about Chuck Rocha while he's out on a boat. He's not going to be listening to this.
No, we'll find out if he listens to it anyway. We'll just talk about it. If he doesn't say anything, we'll know he's not listening to his own podcast.
That's our test. We got to sneak in some things and then say, "Hey, Chuck, did you hear the part where we said?" No, but Mike, thanks for having me. And obviously, you think and talk a lot about this, and you're so respected on this work. Every reporter I talk to, at some point, will say something like, "I don't know. Well, what about the third generation?" And I'm like, "Okay, let me guess who you were talking to right before me." And so it's good to one-on-one have the Madrid Odio conversation.
And just we'll get into that because I've learned from you this cycle too that it's not as simple as that, and that's true, and that I think in many ways presents a whole host of other challenges for the Democratic Party. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Carlos and I are friends and we're colleagues, and I respect his brain. We sometimes draw different conclusions. I think that's healthy. Anybody who knows me and listens to me will know that I can be a little bit more acerbic than I mean to be. I just didn't get good manners when I was raised, I think. But I'm particularly intrigued by people who have a really keen understanding of this. And I think we probably agree on 85% of this stuff. And that 15% matters. That difference matters. And that's where we can refine this and get better. And as you mentioned, there are more and more and more experts in this space, which is good, especially as younger data scientists get into the field. And as the Latino vote gets bigger and more nuanced, we are all learning a lot more. And I think we're all learning from each other. And again, I think it's why this year is particularly fascinating because it is not, there's no way you can slice this to say that this is just these are simple foregone conclusions. This is getting more complex. It's getting more challenging. It's getting more interesting, I think, for people like us who spend every day looking at it. And share with us, if you could, just broadly, what did happen, what didn't happen, what are things that we can confidently say did happen, Carlos, and what can we confidently say didn't happen? Is that fair? Is that a fair question?
That's a great way to set it up. And I'll say, I think there are two stories that people who really want to understand this election and what it means going forward need to be able to hold in their head at the same time. One is that there was a broad swing against Democrats. So it's a 6-point shift nationally. Trump improves on his margins in 9 out of 10 counties. You cannot reduce that to any one demographic. So as we're talking about people to blame, which by the way is never a great idea when it comes to elections generally, but just to be clear, the Trump win is much broader than the shifts we're going to talk about today. In fact, they shouldn't have surprised people quite the way they did. Those of us who were paying attention, I think the magnitude of some of them was bigger. But I think especially in the battleground states, a lot of this was known. And that's why, to some extent, the map had been narrowed to Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And Trump did not win in any of those states because of Latinos. You could wipe out the Latino shift in Pennsylvania and Trump still wins. So I think it's important to say, just because of the tenor of the conversation over the last week. That said, we cannot have our heads in the sand. So there's a different story, which is these are eye-popping shifts. This is meaningful shifts among Latino voters that we have to contend with, because this is now 2 cycles in a row. Trump gets about 30%, 29, 30% of the vote, of Latino vote in 2016. In 2020, it's around 38%. There's no way, given what we're seeing right now, that it's not above 40%. And I would say it's probably around at least 43. So I'd say 43 to 46% is the right range. We will know more as we have the Pew validated survey, as we have Catalyst once voter files come back, and we can get individual level data to inform it. But that,
explain that really quickly to everybody, because the exit polls have a way of unfortunately becoming reality, right, and setting this narrative. But the exit polls are notoriously, there's a lot of they're not accurate, and a lot of Edison research and AP, to their credit, will say we're not trying to pinpoint, we're trying to pick a winner here. We're not looking to get the exact numbers of what happened here. You got to wait for Catalyst, and explain, if you don't mind, who Catalyst is and what the precinct data means.
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing about the exit polls is, because people no longer vote at a polling place in great numbers, the way that Edison surveys how they voted is by calling them, by doing web surveys. They poll them. So the exit poll is a poll. And so everything that we know about polling and its inaccuracies applies also to the exit polls. And we've seen what that means. I mean, there was a whole narrative in 2016 that Trump won white women. That later was debunked. It wasn't, you could see in the data that it wasn't true, but that narrative took hold because in the exit polls it showed it. So we're seeing the same thing happen here. There's also AP Votecast, which is an alternate exit poll, which tends to be more reliable because they update it as turnout composition becomes clear. So as you actually see the results, they try to calibrate it to what really happened. And so they get a little more reliable, but it still is rife with a lot of error as well. Obviously every state keeps a voter file. They keep a record of who voted and who didn't. And when that becomes available, you have firms like Catalyst, which is a major Democratic data firm, but is widely respected because of their rigor. That takes that data and incorporates it into everything else they already have. So they've kept a lot of information on a lot of people. They also bring in polling data, and they do modeling to provide estimates that kind of bridge the world of survey data with what you're actually seeing down to an individual level. We know a lot about a voter up to a certain point, and you can kind of start figuring out what is real and get to a little bit of a deeper sense of what's happening at a demographic level. Pew is also, obviously a gold standard in research. And when they do their big survey, they validate it. So they match it to the voter file. So they're looking at people who they know from the administrative files actually voted in 2024 instead of just taking their word for it.
So when will Catalyst, what are the dates of when all of this will be certified, one, and then two, is your firm going to be putting out kind of an almanac of what happened in 2024?
You should ask Catalyst. Michael Frias, CEO, should come on this podcast if he has not before. I ask them every day, so we'll see. I mean, it usually does take a little bit of time. The first voter file updates start coming in about a month. Georgia's very fast, for example, but others take a long time.
California still hasn't counted.
I mean, we don't have California results. We don't have Nevada precinct level results yet. So there are various places that are going to take longer. Our 2020 postmortem, we did a arduous process that involved polling and focus groups, additional data analysis, individual level like ethnographic interviews. Man, I hope we don't go as deep as we did last time because it took a lot of years off my life. But we did two editions.
We hope you do.
We did two like 100+ slide reports. The first one was in April of 2021. The second was December of 2021. After 2022, we did one big one that was in June, I want to say. So, there's what we're putting out short term. Right now we've been deep in precincts, trying to glean what we can from actual results in Hispanic heavy areas, and I'm happy to talk through what we've seen there.
Yeah,
just to get an initial sense, right? Just a level check.
Yeah,
well, we also talk
riff,
about
man. Yeah.
well, we also talk about, and then like later on we'll go deeper into explanations. But I really think there's a lot we have to know before we can give more definitive takes of what really did and didn't happen.
So what? Yeah, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, you want me to go? Okay, listen. So, obviously, the reason the Latinos became central to the story, even in the exits, it's not just a Latino story, is because of these eye-popping numbers you saw on election night, and they were kind of spread everywhere. I wasn't surprised by Florida, and I wasn't surprised by Texas. Those were things we saw coming. We saw it in our polling. But, the swings in places where we don't poll were more fetching. So, for example, I'm from Miami. I'm a Miamian, but I live in Hudson County, New Jersey. I live in West New York. The Cubans who didn't go to Miami went to West New York and Union City. And the shifts in Hudson County were surprising to me. The shifts in New York City, their magnitude was surprising. And as we dug into the data, what you see is a picture that cuts across geography and urbanicity and country of origin and a lot of the other divisions that we talk about justifiably divide Latino community, right? Latinos are a variety of different communities and experiences that we stitch together under this umbrella of Latino. And yet, Latinos might not be a monolith, but they moved as a group in this election as they did in 2020. So, Lawrence, Massachusetts, 82% Hispanic, mostly Dominican. Trump had gotten 25% of the vote in 2020. In 2024, he got 41%. Okay, so that is a 16-point increase for Trump in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So if you stretch back to 2016, he's increased his share of the two-way vote 26 points. Truly, truly massive. But if you look at the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas gets a lot of attention. Not just our county, but you look at the four that make up RGV, which we looked at: Cameron, Hidalgo, Willacy, and Starr. And you look at the whole of it, and it was about a 10-point shift. So Trump had gotten 42% of the vote in 2020, and now got 52% of the vote. Actually, outright won the RGV counties. But if you stretch it back to 2016, there had been between 16 and 20, a 12-point shift. So overall, that's a 20-point shift from 2016 to 2024. So as we start thinking about theories of why this happened, it's really important that we not get too provincial. People love to trot out their pet theories. Russ Contreras at Axios had a whole article about how like Hispanic farmers in New Mexico, their way of life is threatened by federal regulations on endangered species. Cool, bro. Like, I'm sure that's like very meaningful to a segment of people, but it's not going to explain why it's not going to explain New Jersey. It's not going to explain New Jersey. It's not going to explain, why among South Americans in Broward County, Florida, you had a 9-point shift from 40 to 49%.
Right.
And shifts in Broward County among South Americans are not going to explain to you Milwaukee, where Trump did 6 points better in Milwaukee among what is a heavily Mexican American community, or in Kent County, which is Michigan, went from 18% to 27%. These are shifts that cut across a lot of these divisions. And so for big shifts like this, you need big explanations. Little theories, like people use Latinx too much, are not sufficient to explain something this big, even if they might be part of the stew.
So this begs an interesting question, and I don't want to get too much into the campaigns and what they did and didn't do, because we don't know yet. We don't know, and it's too easy to jump into these conclusions. But I think when it is this broad, the one common glue between Dominicans in New Jersey, Cubans in Miami-Dade, Mexican Americans in the RGV is this blue collar glue this economic glue, arguably, right? It's not necessarily a racial or ethnic correlation. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I'm asking you. But one of the things that I would talk to a lot of reporters saying, it's really remarkable, like what the Harris campaign is doing with this micro targeting stuff with these Latino subgroups, and the Trump campaign isn't doing anything. And my answer was, that's exactly the way you should be approaching it. Is they need to look at the bigger through line, which is more obvious. Everyone's trying to micro target and look down to these subgroups and talk to them in these different nuanced way. The glue is the working class glue. It's the glue that's shifting broadly in the country, where Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the blue collar working class. Is that missing a lot to say that?
I mean, it's yes, and it's yes and because I think this is listen, we're here so we can unpack it. It's hard to unpack on Twitter because where like you don't have that many characters, you got a character limit to contend with, which is that it's both and. I mean, look, we have to figure out the Latino piece. We also have to broaden up and think about men and what's going on with men, and then we have to broaden up and think about what's happening with the working class, because it is broadly about working people, and it's about the fact that there are two realities in this country. There is a broad divide, some part of which is driven by economics, but it's not exclusively economic. There's a cultural divide.
Yes.
That is meaningful, where people just are interpreting world events through an entirely different lens. People say to me, how can they vote? How can people vote for Donald Trump when he said X or Z? Like, they didn't hear that he said X or Y. And they certainly didn't hear that he said X or Y as framed for us by MSNBC, and by like the liberal podcast sphere, or by Twitter. So it is to say people are just getting a different set of information. It's not disinformation. Of course, like some of it could be fictions, but there's fiction on the liberal side too. It's just understanding of how media operates in this day and age, and how people receive information, especially how they get it from their friends and family, because so much of what we're talking about is a social factor. That said, you can't erase the role of identity. As I just said, the movement's happening across people who the only thing they have in common is that they identify as Hispanic. They still identify as Hispanic. There is something to it, even if what's happening is that the bond of being Hispanic tied to being a Democrat is loosened. It doesn't mean that Trump was running a colorblind campaign. Listen, I actually would argue Trump did identity politics more than Harris did. I mean, Trump was doing Latino Americans for Trump, which, by the way, is incredible framing, Latino Americans for Trump.
Great.
Trump was talking about Hispanic jobs and black jobs. That's straight up identity politics. Everything he says to white people is identity politics. Harris actually was trying to run less of an identitarian focused campaign. She never spoke Spanish. She never talked about being the daughter of an immigrant. It was always the daughter of a single working mother. There were a lot of things that she avoided that were kind of the arsenal traditionally of identity politics. When she went to Vegas for Hispanic Heritage Month, and you would have expected it to be a big like Hispanic themed event, you weren't seeing that to the extent you have in the past. Ruben Gallego, who won in Arizona, he ran a big Latino focused campaign with the help of Chuck Rocha. He was doing rodeos. He was doing, let's go watch the Canelo fight. He was leaning hard into it. However, there's a dumb way to do it, and there's a good way to do it. Ruben was doing it the good way, right? There's a dumb way to say, like, I don't have a plan, so what I'm just going to do is like hope that I say Latino a lot and it's going to break through. As opposed to saying, I'm going to speak to you as a working person who is looking out for your family, and as someone who often does not feel invited or included in the political process. You have to kind of hit on both of those.
So talk to me about the Madison Square Garden rally, this heavily imbued identity racist rally. I'm gonna, before I get your answer, I want to weigh in a little bit here. I'll use the prerogative of the host microphone and say I actually do think it hurt Trump. I think you could have seen another point or two bigger for Trump. But I do think it hurt. A lot of people are calling saying, why didn't it hurt him? I'm like, I think it did. I think that, what we're seeing is that it probably did hurt him. Maybe not in the way that we thought it did, but I think it was limiting. What are your thoughts on that? Did it help him? Did it hurt him? Did it not matter?
This is one of the things, I allowed myself some hope that I now have come to realize was a little optimistic.
Same.
because we're so used to, man, in the era of Trump, the guy says things, his people say things, we learn things all the time. I mean, only weeks earlier, we learned that he said um, that he referred to Vanessa Guillen as that fucking Mexican. And that was a blip on the radar. Nobody talked about it after that night.
Yeah.
And you came to get used to the fact that like nothing moved the needle in the era of Trump. And I just thought there was something about the Puerto Rico joke. You were going after Puerto Ricans, which is always a mistake. And he
Right.
was doing it as people were voting in a way that like brought Bad Bunny and Ricky Martin and all these people off the sidelines in a way that was blowing up WhatsApp. You heard
Yeah.
all of the anecdotal stories and you said, man, this has got to hurt him. And yet, some of the biggest shifts for Trump were Osceola County, which is in Florida, which is
Florida.
Kissimmee, heavily
Yep.
Puerto Rican. It was Allentown and Reading in Pennsylvania. The exact places that you would have expected to see this play out, you didn't see the shift. And to your point, it could have been worse. You know, I did think it came in, the MSG comment was made a day before the end of early vote in Pennsylvania. So like maybe there was something on election day, maybe it was just too late to actually make any larger movement. And
Mhm.
yet we didn't really see it. Now, it outside of Puerto Ricans, I didn't really have much hope that it would change anything. And I think the larger takeaway is just Trump's racism is baked into the equation. They get it. He's a racist.
So,
And people who are voting for him are voting for him in spite of the fact that they know he's a racist,
including Latinos.
including Latinos. Yeah.
Yeah. And so do you think, and again, I think you've probably gotten some of it. I've gotten a lot of it on social media. I know a lot of reporters and journals are. There's just been this blowback, like on Latinos and Latino men, which are just like, you guys are the devil. You guys are racist. You're misogynist. It's coming to you. I hope you get deported. Why don't you go back to the country you came from? And I'm like, look, I'm Republican. I remember hearing this shit from Republicans in the 80s and the 90s. Now it's coming from white progressives and like black progressive leaders, like literally black people saying, I hope you get deported. I hope you get, sent back to where you came from. Um, wh- how much is there to the Latino racism and Latino sexism stuff that you're seeing in the data?
I mean, first of all, yes, it's been ugly. I mean, I think we've all gotten it. Anybody who is Latino and is on social media commenting on these things has been the recipient of some vile comments
Yeah,
that are coming from white liberals. I mean, this
I
is
know.
not, you know, mimicking the language of the extreme right wing. I mean, it
Yeah.
goes to show there's a book called The Other Divide, and I think it's so right that the real divide in this country is not between the two polar extremes on the partisan spectrum, but rather between people who care about politics and people who don't.
Hmm.
The people who care about politics maybe aren't that dissimilar from each other, as they tell themselves at least.
I need to
Um,
pick that up because that alone maybe explain a lot of what we're seeing, what's going on right now. Just the hyper engaged, the hyper online, right, are seeing the world differently than those that are like, I don't care what Donald Trump said. I'm just not interested in that. I've got other things that I've got to focus on.
That's exactly right. And so they're not following the ins and outs. And by the way, they think that everything that people say about Donald Trump is hyperbolic. They told us in focus groups.
Yeah.
They think it's all political rhetoric. You know, it's actually something that Trump really engineered. I mean, his attacks on fake news were an effort to have everyone question anything that mainstream media was saying. And to some extent it worked. That
Yeah.
people started to feel like this isn't real. People just have it out for Donald Trump, and so they're going to say things. And it made it easier for people to dismiss any news. Even if it was really credible and damaging news, people said, I'm sure there's more to the story. And what we found in focus groups is the extent to which people didn't believe that Trump was going to do the bad things. I mean, people said, especially undecided Latinos, especially undecided Latino men, would
Mhm.
say, I don't think he's going to repeal Obamacare. I don't think he's going to ban abortion. I don't think he's going to deport
Right.
undocumented people who've been here a long time. I think he's just going to deport people who showed up recently or are criminals. And because the reason he's not going to do it is because all he cares about is the economy. He's a businessman, and he knows that if he were to deport people at mass scale, it would disrupt the economy, and he wouldn't do that. And literally, they're like, the reason we like the guy, the reason we're open to him is because he puts the economy above absolutely everything else. That's the reason we'd vote for him. And so they dismiss everything else as like noise. as political rhetoric, things he has to say, things that people say around him, but not things that he at the end of the day will execute.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because 2016, I mean, his main campaign thematic and main campaign promise, the whole predicate for his campaign was, I'm going to build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. He does neither of those things. And so a lot of Latinos are going, this is my point, right? We've heard him say this shit before and he doesn't do it. But there are ICE crackdowns. He does start sending ICE agents into Latino neighborhoods and starts pulling out undocumented workers from assembly lines of manufacturing in California, Los Angeles. It was pervasive. And that leads to 2018, where we had the highest Latino turnout in history. And it was vociferously, angrily, stridently anti-Trump. And it sets back the Republican Party considerably. Do you think that same thing could be brewing if this deportation agenda begins to be implemented?
Immigration, we do the conversation a disservice when we yoke together the two parts of immigration, because there's the border, and then there's what do we do about people who've been here a long time.
Right.
And this debate, this cycle, has been all about the border. And the border is a law and order consideration. And when we did have larger numbers coming here, I'd say the Biden White House was slow to acknowledge.
Yeah.
People are showing up in cities, and we're having a debate whether it's a crisis or not. I don't care whether you call it a crisis or not. And I don't think that Biden needed to be cruel or harsh or tough, but he certainly needed to engage. And I think this White House believed in only talking publicly about things that are popular. And so they didn't lean into the border. And so the impression that was baked at that point and then carried through to focus groups that we were hearing at the very end is that Biden just left the door open and doesn't care what happens. And so this was not like anti-immigrant sentiment among Latinos. This was saying, this is just not an orderly way to deal with this. This is about the fact that now we have homelessness where I live. This is not about what do I think should be our, what should we do about my spouse or my mother or my cousin or my neighbor or someone I go to church with who's undocumented. That's a different conversation, and we weren't having a debate about that. So to your point, family separation was, among Latinos, the most unpopular thing Trump did during his first term by far. In fact, you could see, we split up conservative Latino, liberal Latinos, and how they rated multiple things that he did. Among conservative Latinos, the most popular things he did was reopen the economy quickly after COVID, was tell us that we should live without fear of COVID. There was this whole thing about like prioritizing the economy and getting away from shutdown politics that was very motivating. On things like the border, increasing border security, border spending, more agents, et cetera, conservatives were more supporting of Trump than not, and liberals weren't that far behind, frankly. But on family separation, conservatives were all the way off the chart. Mass rejection of family separation because they want an orderly process, but they want a humane process. The thing is, we have to acknowledge that family separation kind of fell off a little bit. He ended the program. He didn't emphasize immigration at the end of his 2020 campaign. To your question, people voted now thinking that mass deportation meant clear up the cities, send back people who just showed up recently, and send out criminals. And there's very high support for that because Latinos, like all Americans, want order at the border. They didn't think, and we have lots of polling to suggest that they did not believe that mass deportation meant deporting people who've been living and working here for years, if not decades. And so if indeed they do that, and every indication is that's what they're going to do, because I think they're going to want to goose the numbers. They've already said that they're going to do workplace raids, which, by the way, like there were limited ones in his last time, but we haven't seen major workplace raids since the Bush years. Right. And they were incredibly disruptive in the Bush years. I mean, they got massive headlines. I still remember Marshalltown and Postville in Iowa. These were big events when you did these big workplace raids. We haven't seen that in a long time. I think that is going to start changing the conversation when people start realizing that they are breaking up American families. When you take spouses who've been here for decades, who have American spouses, who've got children, American citizens, and they're going to get yanked out and sent out of the country, that's going to open a lot of eyes. And I think that does start to shift the debate.
So what do Democrats do when that happens? And is there a broader strategy than just opposition to Trump? And there's no right or wrong question. That may be the best strategy. Sometimes the best strategy is just waiting until your opponent is going to do what you know they're going to do. And I will guarantee you this: Republicans will overplay their hand on this. That is the one consistent thing that in my 30 years of experience, the Republicans will overdo it. They will go too far. It's not if, it's when. It could be like the first month. It could be the 6th month. It will happen. And I guess my question, the strategic question, Carlos, that I'm asking is when you're advising Democrats, because you will be, is it sufficient to just be in opposition, or do you have to start crafting an actual solution set on either border security or a comprehensive plan, especially when the Republicans have both houses and the executive branch?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And look, they just he today announced Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. So I don't think restraint is going to be
No, no.
the directive here. Look, we know there's, like academics talk about it as thermostatic public opinion, meaning it's like your thermostat at home. Like when it's too hot, you make it colder. When it's too cold, you make it hot. And then generally, the American public, when there is a Republican in office, wants a little bit more Democrat. And when they have a Democrat in office, they want a little more Republican. They move more to the right. And so we're going to have some just reaction to Trump in a great extent. And we saw this, 2004 when Bush won his reelection. And I'm sure you were one of the ones thinking there was going to be like a lasting Republican majority. Then there was a fight about privatizing Social Security that blew up in Republicans' faces. And it was less than 4 years. And 4 years later, you had the Obama election. But similarly, you had the Obama election, which felt historic. Democrats are now going to have a lasting majority buoyed by demographics. And then you had the Obamacare fight. And you had the 2010 midterms and the first great shellacking of Democrats. It's just been every time you've had this, there is a reaction to any major programs that the ruling party tries to implement. And like you said, they're going to overreact. So some part of this is smart politics, which is not falling for Trump's traps, learning from the last time. Democrats cannot be hyperbolic. I've been trying to say this. As much as I just said he's going to do mass deportation. If you start setting the goalposts at he's going to deport 12 million people, he's going to start deporting U.S. citizens, and then he deports 8 million people, he steps back and says, "Look at these crazy people. Look how reasonable I am. I only did 8 million people." We can't allow him to move the goalposts. And I think part of the job is to, as much as possible, try to help shape the mandate. Say, like, look, people voted for this guy to lower prices and to bring order at the border. And everything outside of that is outside of the mandate. And so lowering expectations, say, he said that he wasn't going to do Project 2025. How many times did he disavow Project 2025? Let's strategically take him for his word on that. Because otherwise, if we say he's going to do the whole thing and he does half of it, he is able to distort how people view him. DeSantis has used this playbook in Florida to great effect to make his opponents look like the unreasonable ones. So I think there's an element of restraint from Democrats and reacting. At the same time, you're right. People are so fed up with politics that there has to be another lane that is about transforming the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as it is currently perceived, has such major vulnerabilities that it is going to have to actively shed. And I don't think it's about, I think there are some still core narratives that still work. Some of it's about getting back to basics, frankly. Democrats were, part of the advantage they had is that Republicans were seen as the party of the rich. Democrats as the party of working people. There's still a core of that right now. People have just felt like it's gotten betrayed, but that doesn't feel like a lasting change. And part of it's going to be who are the standard bearers. I think Rubin in Arizona is was an exemplary candidate. It's going to be exemplary Senate who shows a path forward, which is in having candidates and leaders who represent a diverse America, who lean into that. They're not trying to be colorblind. They're not all of a sudden turning their backs on the voters who make up the base of the Democratic Party, but are class conscious. Don't pander What they do is, Latinos like everybody else want to be included in the American story. They don't
Right.
assume that when you put out a message generically, Latinos, like many others, don't assume that that message is for them because they're used to it not being to them. So you have to be explicit about the fact that it's for them somehow.
Yeah.
And at the same time, Latinos don't want to be invited to like a separate party. They want to be invited to the same party as everybody else. And so you have to like lean into the Americanness of Latinos, that you're doing this, whatever you're doing, to benefit everybody. Um, and that's a big part of the rebranding, which is about being broadly multiracial, being class conscious, being progressive in substance. I think there are, especially on the economic side, I think there's room for some of the populism that Trump has taken away from Democrats. And then also being in style, especially more moderate and willing to be independent. Rubin was not the kind of guy who people would believe when somebody said, this guy's taking his orders from the head of the Democratic Party, whoever that is,
Right.
that he's just following the party line or he's following some ideology. I think that's a lot of what people believe, is that politicians are just going to follow whatever some firm set of ideologies, as opposed to being independent minded and considering things as they come. And so that's going to be a big task for Democrats, even as they're being reactive, is to show a little bit of independence, to show that they're willing to be a little bit provocative. That's easier said than done, but at least you have
It
to
is.
understand that's the starting point.
Yeah, and I think there's always this immediately after an election like this, there's always the hand wringing, like, are we done? Are we going to ever get back into a majority? And what you almost always the catalyzing glue is when the Republicans start doing what the Republicans do, people kind of snap out of it and they start coming back together, and the anti-coalition starts to build. But to me, that's the opportunity, is to say, wait a second, what are, and this is a question for you, what are a couple, three policy positions that Democrats can lean into to get Latino working class men back?
Mike, it's a great question. And why I struggle with it is this. Harris rolled out this opportunity agenda,
Yeah.
and it was very popular. I mean, we had in our polls like majority support for some of those planks, even among people who said that they trusted Trump more on the economy.
Yeah.
Why it didn't matter to the extent that Democrats needed it to matter, and we heard in focus groups, was that there was just a credibility gap. That they would say, yeah, that sounds really good. The credit to provide an opportunity for first-time home buyers to be able to purchase a home. So it was an aid for down payment. People would say, that sounds good. There's no way they're going to do it. There's no way they're going to be able to do it. Expanding childcare, expanding the child tax credit. There were a lot of popular things. Raising the taxes on the rich is always very popular. Protecting Social Security and Medicare. All these things are individually popular. What Democrats have is a credibility gap.
Is it fair? Is it a fair one or an unfair one?
The part of it that's, if I'm seeing this from the perspective of someone who was in the Biden White House, I'd say, Jesus Christ, we passed so many bills. We did so much. How could possibly people think we don't deliver? And so I think that part is somewhat unfair. I think the part that's fair is that the part of the economy that's cultural. The economy is not just the economy. The economy is, do you get my life? Do you respect my life?
Relatable.
Are you on my side? Are you
Yeah.
fighting on my side? Do I
Yeah.
get that you're fighting on my side? You can throw policies at me all day long, but do I think that you actually get me?
When I saw
it's a bigger one.
When I saw the New York Times Siena Latino poll they did about a week before the election, I was like, oh shit. And the reason why, to your point, was a majority of Latinos, a majority said the Democratic Party, quote, understands people like me. But when it came down to whether Democrats will do anything that will measurably improve my life, the numbers cratered. And then Trump, their polling had Trump at 37. But 7% of Latino Trump supporters said he doesn't understand or get people like me, which I thought was fascinating. It's like fully 7%, which is, basically, 20% of his support was saying he's not one of us. But at this point, kind of, what have you got to lose? Like he kind of said, right? Like, what do you got to lose?
That's right.
And maybe that will be the test of 2018 or 2028. Jesus Christ, these years are ticking off quickly. but that I think is the test, is what will bring Latinos back, because I think there's a huge opportunity to have this vote base move back. I don't think any of this is permanent. I think there's a long-term, flattening out of parity that we may see, over the next decade or so. But the idea,
Yeah.
I think people really need to listen to what you're saying, which is, I spoke to a very prominent good Democrat in California who's been there, 40 years. He said, it's not that Democrats have a Latino problem; it's that Latinos now have a Democrat problem.
Mm,
They're just not buying it as much as they used
yeah.
to, and a part of that is a function of the current economic conditions. And
Yeah.
as economic conditions do improve, we may see some of this, the rise in this recognition and understanding that this guy's not like us. This party doesn't reflect us. This is an anti-Latino. And maybe you start to see a rise again in
Yeah.
ethnic cultural sensitivity. I don't know. I mean, what do you think of that?
Look, the challenge is, because I want to be sober about the challenge. People were overriding their partisanship, right? People who previously identified as Democrat were voting for Donald Trump. It takes a lot to get there. It's a complicated override sequence. It's not one switch. It's like a bunch of switches, like setting off a nuclear bomb, right? Which so it's COVID. COVID scrambled people in a significant manner. It's then Biden, Biden as the leader who was not seen as up to the task, right? I love the man, but he was not perceived to have the vitality to lead us out of crisis. It was the fact that people voted for him and then you were beleaguered by crisis. What came out in our polling was the extent to which Latinos just felt insecurity by the end of, in the first couple of years into the administration. They felt insecurity physical in terms of gun violence, in terms of crime, and they felt it economically in terms of housing costs, healthcare costs, and just rising prices generally. And then you have Trump, who they feel is a businessman who cares about the economy, and they felt like, in retrospect, their economic lives, they had more money in their pocket when he was last president. So you add all that up into a stew, and then maybe you start getting some defection. And by the way, we saw real defection. I want to be very clear about this. We were seeing it in our polling. In our last poll, 9% of Latinos who told us they voted for Joe Biden in 2020 said they were going to vote for Donald Trump this time. 9%. That's meaningful. When you look at it, of all registered Latinos, that accounts for 4%. That's a 4-point shift right there. On top of that, you then have movement among a more irregular voting Latino. Not the new guys necessarily, but more people who've been on the rolls, but stayed on the sidelines, didn't vote in 2020, even though they were eligible or registered to do so. Trump has a way to pull that kind of voter off the sidelines. He did it with white working class voters, and now I think he did it with a kind of working class Latino as well.
Where was Latino turnout?
Man, we're still, the story on
There's
turnout
no
we won't have until we get the voter files back. I mean,
Yeah.
there are some indications. A Wall Street Journal analysis said that the turnout drop among Hispanic counties, densely Hispanic counties, was less than among other counties. Turnout's clearly a very, very big part of the story, especially in some of the places where you saw the biggest shifts. Florida, it's a big turnout story. Democrats are entirely demoralized. So everywhere it's a mix of vote switching, of Democrats, Biden voters switching and voting for Trump, which, by the way, is worth, the rule of thumb is it's worth twice the value of a new voter is a vote that switches over, because you're subtracting it and adding it at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a mix of both everywhere, essentially. But the biggest challenge is when somebody takes that leap and they vote for a Republican or for Trump for the first time, there is a tendency to then match other behaviors to that decision. And so Democrats have a limited point here to intervene. At the same time, that I believe very stridently that while this kind of looks and sounds like a realignment, maybe it is a realignment, I think it looks like we're at the beginning of one when you have 2 cycles in a row like this. And yet at the same time, realignments are not irreversible and they're not inevitable, especially when you have a group that's this dynamic. Latinos are incredibly swingy and Latinos are fast changing. The voters who show up in 2028 are not going to be the same who showed up this time around. At least 30% of Latinos who voted in 24 did not vote in 2020. It keeps churning.
Yeah.
And so anybody who takes this vote for granted or assumes that what happened today is on some sort of linear, track, and can't be deviated is making a terrible mistake.
Was this avoidable?
I think it was avoidable 3 years ago. I think it was avoidable 2 years ago. I don't know that it was avoidable 6 months ago.
Yeah.
When Harris joined and entered the race, she picked up a lot of votes that Trump had lost.
Mhm.
Some of them were too far gone at that point, though. I think if Biden had been on the ticket, he would have gotten blown out. It would have been an absolute landslide.
Okay.
I think a lot of this was cooked far in advance of that turnover. I think the campaign worked to some extent. You can see it already in the numbers in the battleground states versus others. There was clearly a campaign effect. It's just when you have a 6-point swing from the last election, a campaign is not going to be able to make up that kind of difference. So I think a lot of these things, frankly, began in 2021
Yeah.
and worsened in 2023. And then there was little you could do to fix them by the middle of 2024.
So I think the next big question that we'll be facing as we head into the midterms is going to be a function of the mass deportation issues. That is my opinion. And again, I think that there will be a visceral pushback. The question is going to be, are we looking at this like the Madison Square Garden effect and whether it did or didn't move Latinos the way we thought they would, or was it more of
Yeah.
a 2018 effect where the threat is more existential and not abstract the way Madison Square Garden was? Is that a fair characterization, or do you think it'll be driven more by economic issues and economic
I mean,
concerns?
is he going to lower prices, Mike? I mean, because that's what he was elected to do. He's elected to lower prices. He's going to lower prices, or is he going to ram through the tariffs?
Yeah.
And is there going to be a big shock from the tariffs where prices actually go up? That to me is going to be the central question. Either
It's
he
not only
does the tariffs as he promised, and you're going to see prices go up, or he doesn't do the tariffs as he promised, and he's going to get a revolt from his base. So which is it?
well, I think it's even more complicated than that. Mass deportations is inflationary. I mean, what the hell
Yes,
do they
that's right.
what the hell do they think is holding prices down with the labor workforce? Like everything he's proposed is incredibly inflationary and disruptive to markets. So I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing if if I'm advising the Democrats, I'm just preparing for that inevitability. And that's why I asked you the earlier question is, does more need to be done? And it's a very fair, very legitimate answer to say no. No, a lot of this can just come right back in opposition the same way it did, I would argue, in 2018, maybe even bigger. That pushback, that blowback could be bigger. And then the story coming out of it is, yeah, Latinos were offended by the racial and cultural insensitivity and the immigration issue. And there's a multi-generational Latino voting bloc again that's pushing back against Republican anti-immigrant messaging. And my worry then is, have the Democrats then just continued to be reliant on Republican overplaying and Republican racism to win elections? Because if you do, I think it leaves you exposed in many ways to what happened in 2024.
I think that's right. And I think, first of all, I say I don't want to oversimplify the reaction side of this, which is to say it's not just Democrats sitting back, it's knowing which pitches to swing at. Because what Trump does is throw a lot of fastballs in great volume in a way that confounds. And oftentimes it either leaves you not reacting at all to things you should be fighting or swinging at the wrong balls and picking fights that benefit Trump, that are the divides he actually wants to accentuate. And so a lot of this is about being selective and knowing where to push back and how. And then I think a lot of the proactive thing really does come out in leadership, in who are the messengers of the Democratic Party and of the left of center wing in this country, who are the avatars of liberalism and of anti-Trump. That's a lot of where the more proactive part comes in, is because those messengers relay a lot about the image of this new Democratic Party.
Do you think the Democratic Party has learned something in 2024 that it did not learn in 2020?
I think it's too early to tell. I'm going to choose to be optimistic.
Yeah.
I will say there's a lot to discourage in the first week since the election.
Mhm.
I think you see a lot of people writing takes this week that they could have written even if Harris had won. A lot of takes that they maybe wrote like a month ago and are just publishing now. And I think if you have takes that are not actually reactive to what happened and to the surprises of election night, then I can't take you very seriously.
Yeah.
Uh, if you're just talking your book. So I want to stay optimistic. I think there's still a lot of time, even if, some of the initial reactions are a little discouraging.
Is there anything we haven't covered, Carlos, that listeners need to know and be thinking about?
I'd say one thing that you and I talk a lot about, which is the generational change, because I do think the US born element of this is really important as we go forward. Listen, also, Democrats can't be fighting the last war. They have to be thinking forward. I think if there's something, as I look back at tactical decisions as opposed to big strategic ones, one that kind of gnaws at me is the underinvestment on voter registration. Voter registration used to be bread and butter, some of the basics. I think at some point there was an overemphasis on voter registration. Oh, we just got to register these people and then they're going to vote with us. That I thought was condescending and limited. You actually have to engage people. But then I think there was a swing in the other direction where Latino registration was not properly funded in the way it needed to. And that's a big mistake when a lot of the new votes, a lot of how Democratic support has stayed high among Latinos was by bringing in new voters, young voters who are on your side and engaging them. And so I think being forward-looking in multiple regards matters. At the same time, that I think it's important to say a lot of the swing is among people who are immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. One of the things we've talked about is I don't think the third generation moment has hit yet. I think we're still in the second generation moment. I think the children of immigrants are coming into force in this election in a big way.
Yeah.
And they're stuck in the middle. There's a lot of cross pressures there for people closer to the immigrant experience. They tend to be less partisan because a lot of your partisanship you pick up from your parents. And if your parents weren't raised in the American political system, they're not going to have it. So there's a lot of swing. And so I think as we think about this going forward, paying more attention to that second generation, I think is probably a good place to begin the reckoning and the rebuilding that needs to happen.
I think that's probably very, very good, solid, sound advice. Carlos, thank you so much for your time. I'm hoping you'll come on and visit with us more regularly as you learn more, as there's more that we should know, as the audience should know. Again, if you're not following Carlos, where should people follow you? Because I know you're going to be regularly updating what you're finding.
Yeah, our website, we are equis.us. We put resources up there, and then I'm still posting fairly regularly on the artist formerly known as Twitter. So I'm just at Carlos Odio, O-D as in dog, I-O. And I'm increasingly moving to Blue Sky for nerdier, wonkier takes in a place where people aren't hoping I end up in a detention camp.
Gulag somewhere. Yeah. Again, Carlos, thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly insightful. Make sure you're following him because, again, a lot of new data is going to be coming out in the coming weeks and or months, and it's going to absolutely play a critical role on the strategic considerations, the way Democrats approach the upcoming Trump administration and the mass deportation issues and the immigration fights, along with everything else related to the economy. Carlos, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me, and welcome. Happy to come back anytime. You know where to find me.
All right, we'll reach out. Thanks, buddy. Talk to you all
soon. Thanks, Mike.